Welcome into Mississippi State Live here on the voice of college football. Andrew Miller here on a Monday night, back after my brief hiatus. Obviously, like I said, took the uh, late week show off. I was feeling under the weather, batting a little bit of a cold. I have moved past that. Good to go. I just knew Thursday night I was not going to be good to talk for however long as we were going to have to go Thursday. I say that as my voice sounds scruffy right now, so I guess we'll see. But I've moved past pretty much everything symptom wise from where I was at the end of last week. Yeah, I never really got that sick. It was just not well enough to sit and chat for a while. But we're back. I'm glad to be back. I'm going to have a great show tonight where we spend probably an hour and a half diving deeply into the Super Bowl halftime show. That is the biggest thing we're going to get into tonight is talk about your opinions on Bad Bunny in the halftime show or to the Turning Point halftime show, whatever your thoughts are on that. That's what we're diving in tonight. Obviously, no, I'm not doing that. I wouldn't touch that conversation with a 10-foot pole. I will say I do think we as a society have to get past the point of not caring so much about a freaking halftime show that it becomes this massive conversation for the days that follow. But it's where we're at. You're allowed whatever opinion you want on that. Obviously, we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Mississippi State football. So that's why we're back. Appreciate everyone for tuning in. If you could leave us a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and have those notifications turned on so you do know when we do go live. And if you could tell all the Bulldog fans in your life about what we're doing here at Mississippi State Live, bring them over to the channel. Get them to subscribe, get them to tune in, and continue to grow this thing because we're going to have a lot of great football content in the offseason. I'm going to talk some baseball at a certain point as well. I think I've said before, I don't consider myself locked in enough to really give you true opinions on MSU baseball. You know, I can look at the roster and be like, yeah, they're really good. But in terms of how they stack up relative to the rest of the SEC, I don't know the rest of the league all that well. But obviously, I'm sure we'll have to have some baseball conversation. Maybe that could be something fun for Thursday night call-in show. Some of your guys' thoughts on baseball, where it's a little bit more of the call-in shows can be a bit of a choose-your-own-adventure type deal. And obviously, I know we don't get a ton of calls as it is, but for those of you who do call in, obviously appreciate the conversation, and we kind of take it whatever direction people want to. So maybe we can get some early thoughts from a lot of you guys on baseball on Thursday night. I know basketball's not really giving us anything to talk about at this point. So typically we would at this point be trying to mix in some basketball conversation, but that's just not going to happen with this team. Don't necessarily have a big show planned for this evening. Don't have a bunch of topics that we want to get into. I did have multiple things I wanted to hit, but then I realized some of the information I was going to use for one of the topics needs to be updated further. So we're going to have to put a hold on that. I wanted to talk about where Mississippi State stands from a returning production standpoint within the SEC. There's a guy on Twitter, Dog Stats, I believe, who put together some really cool stuff looking at returning offensive line production is where it really jumped off because people noted like South Carolina leads the country in total number of offensive line snaps returning this year between the players on the roster and the players coming in. Will checking in. Nice haircut, Coach. Yeah, I was long overdue. We'll just derail what I was saying. That's fine. I don't mind my hair being a little bit longer, like the length that it was at, but the problem is, one, my hair just doesn't want to sit in one spot, so it tends to like kind of swoop up in a weird place. Also, I mean, your boy is losing his hair and losing it quick. So when you're losing the hair on top and it's long on the sides, it's just not a great look. So keeping it not really high and tight, but I mean it's pretty cut down. Probably the better move. But yeah, I had gone several months without a haircut, and every time I do that, it's not even a case of wanting my hair to grow it out. It's pure laziness of not wanting to go get a haircut. But I finally went and got that taken care of. But anyway, back to the returning production stuff. Dog Stats, he's a Georgia guy. He put together a really cool database with a lot of returning production numbers. And I was looking through some of the stuff from Mississippi State. I wanted to talk about where they stacked up in the SEC. And I'd already helped him. He did not have, I think it was DJ Chester from LSU entered on State's roster. So once State got him included, that bumped up their numbers quite a bit. But I was looking today, there's a few defensive players he doesn't have. There's a couple guys he has on the roster that have transferred out. So I messaged him. He liked it, so I know he saw it. So hopefully that stuff gets updated and we can talk about it. Because again, I wanted to break down where does state kind of stand on some early returning production numbers within the SEC. How much does that stuff really matter? It obviously varies depending on the teams, although I do think we're in an era where having a very experienced roster certainly does matter. And having guys that have played a lot of football, whether they've been in your program or not in your program, it's mattering more and more and more when you've got kids who, one, are transferring a lot without the playing time. So bringing people in who have played a lot of football instead of having to rely on guys who haven't done it. But two, you're in an era where players obviously are staying in college longer because they don't feel the need to go chase the bag in the NFL. So if you can have a veteran roster and you don't lose those guys to the next level, that can help you out quite a bit. So I wanted to get into some of that stuff. We'll have to save that for another episode again until the stuff gets updated. But speaking of Mississippi State and the roster, where they're at, I thought a fun conversation for this evening, and I don't know how long we'll go. I'm just going to kind of run down through these things. Has State gotten the roster back to being SEC level? Jeff Lebby took over a roster in 2024 that was, forget SEC caliber. That was not a power conference caliber roster. They had individual players that could play at power conference level. They essentially had a mid-tier G5 roster, all things considered. And I feel confident in saying that by fact that they weren't able to just completely show up and roll out of bed and beat the brakes off of UMass. By the fact that they got blown out at home by Toledo, I can't even try to say that was a power conference level roster. And Will already saying he votes yes. Top tier, not even close, but serviceable. We'll see. And again, I wanted to get into this because that roster just was not any good, right? They could not compete with anybody in the SEC. And I know they had some games that were technically close, but there's a point that has been made a few times that if Mississippi State was a team that how much of those games being close was a product of opponents recognizing that they could, I talked about State not being able to roll out of bed and go beat UMass. How much was it those teams that State played competitively recognizing, hey, we can go roll out of bed and probably beat Mississippi State? There were a couple teams that got in trouble, right? Texas A&M kind of got in trouble and State had to fight back, had to fight back. The Egg Bowl's the Egg Bowl. That's its own unique thing. The rivalry aspect obviously played a role when State just played as well as they did defensively all year in that game. I don't think anybody saw that performance coming, with offensively being a disaster in that game, at least for the final three quarters. But that was not a good roster. And you look at the talent top to bottom. Obviously, they had some very talented skill players. At receiver specifically, you had a very good group of receivers that season. Those guys absolutely could have been played at other power conference programs. You did have a power conference. I would say you had power conference quarterback play. Blake Shapen, say what we will about the guy when he was healthy. And I think if you gave him adequate protection, you're probably talking about a guy that is a serviceable power conference quarterback. And I think Michael Van Buren, even though he's gone to USF, I think he is too. I think Van Buren, I was kind of talking about the SEC show. Tennessee's had this whole big quest for a quarterback. And I think it would have, if I was them, I would have just gone and gotten MVB to go beat Tennessee's quarterback. I think he would have handled that well. So they had the quarterback talent that was there. I think running back, you had guys who were good enough. That was kind of it. Defensively, individual players were talented, right? Isaac Smith was obviously very, very good. Bryce Pollock ended up being very, very good. I just don't think a lot of us realized it at the time. There were guys in the linebacker room. I think by the end, Stone Glenn and Nick Mitchell are guys you would say could do enough at linebacker. But defensive line, you had nobody. Kelly Jones was not the player that he was yet. So you're talking about opposite of him, Diego Brumfield, or opposite of Bryce Pollock, Diego Brumfield. You were playing why am I blanking on his name? One of State's safeties played corner quite a bit. Brian Lanier. They played him at corner quite a bit that season. You just didn't have guys. And there's a few guys on this defensive line that have gotten better. Again, at the time, though, they were not ready to be guys to compete within the SEC. And then obviously there's offensive line. It was not a power conference quality offensive line. Just was not. So that was not a roster that you were able to be successful with. And how much of that is to blame of Jeff Lebby for the situation that he had took over when you can go out and get guys in the portal? I don't know. How much of that is to blame an NIL situation with Mississippi State where they needed to be financially at that point to really be able to go out and get guys? I don't know. How much of that was the previous staff? And I love Mike Leach, but there's no question that his approach to recruiting was not, at least in terms of the guys that he put in charge and some of the roles that he gave to some of his staffers, was not good enough to go and win the battles they needed to get the talent they needed along the lines of scrimmage and on the defense. And when you start talking about having an SEC caliber roster, those are really the two spots that I tend to look at a lot. It's offensive line, lines of scrimmage in general, and then defensive talent top to bottom. You can go across the country and find good skill players. Teams under the West Coast can have big-time talent at receiver and at running back, and anybody can have talent at quarterback. I think, the Midwest, a lot of those teams do have really talented, big, bulky, powerful offensive lines. And I think they play hard-nosed defense, but I think sometimes they lack the athletes on the defensive side of the ball. I think you get into the SEC, and it's truly – that's a spot you can have athletes at every single position on the field for sure. But having the big dudes up front along the lines of scrimmage is a huge part of it. And then just having big-time athletes across the board defensively is a big part of it. Now, offensive skill talent, again, you put the same athletes out on offense. I just think it stands out more in the SEC. State had neither in 2024. You didn't have it at either spot there. And I think this past season, 2025, in terms of, where were they at? Offensive line still wasn't there. We know for a fact the O-line was not there in terms of being good enough to compete within the SEC. Defensive line was still not there. It was better. As I've described it, I think a lot of the guys State were rolling out there on the defensive line were players that were acceptable rotational pieces within the SEC, not guys you want to be starting, at least across the board. If any one of those guys was a starter, okay. If you're talking about we're starting 3 or 4 of these guys at once, not good enough. Elsewhere on the defense, though, I do think you got to a point where you had more of those athletes. I think you had the athletes at linebacker. I think your safety group ended up being okay. And obviously Kelly Jones emerged. Now, you didn't have a corner opposite of him. But I think the secondary Mississippi State rolled out last year, if you put a serviceable defensive line in front of them, you're probably talking about a team that could have been okay defensively. Still don't know if not the top to bottom level of athletes, but you had more athletes on that defense than you had the previous season. So where are you at this year? That's kind of the big question for Mississippi State. And I think you almost have to go back and compare to, well, where were you before Jeff Lebby arrived? Because the 2023 roster, and that's Zach Arnett, but it's a lot of, the players that Leach guys plus guys, Leach had inherited. That's the last time you would say Mississippi State probably still had an SEC level roster. Now, I know that team went 5-7 and had some really, really ugly performances. I would also say that the leading cause to all of those issues was the schematic shift and how that impacted the positions you had on that roster. But top to bottom, that was a roster that, keep in mind, we were talking about, can this team win 8, 9, some were going crazy saying 10 games in the SEC with that 2023 roster, because you had a lot of guys back. You had a lot of experience back on that team on both sides of the ball. You were losing some key players on the defense for sure, but your overall level of experience was still really good. And your starting group was one that you thought could win a lot of games and be competitive within the SEC. And I think we probably, in hindsight, overrated a few of those spots. Because I have said, even if you had held on to Leach, if Leach had not passed away and you were running things back, I don't know that team is definitely jumping up and is a definite top 20 type team nationally. But I think they would have probably had a season similar to what they did the year before. In 2022, that was a 9-win football team. 9-4, that was a good year. Top 25 team. I think they could have been a team like that once again, which still would have been a good season. And obviously, the schematic shift, the coaching change, they took the decline. So what I want to do, as I've kind of done this long preamble here, is get into roster-wise, where were you at in 2023, and how do I look at the 2025 roster compare? On paper, do you compare the 2025 roster to 2023? And again, keep in mind, 2023, we're not talking about striving for a 5-7 type season. Look, they went 5-7 this past year with a roster that was not SEC level. You can find ways to win some football games here or there. I think they also they kind of lucked out, if we're being completely honest, with Arkansas being a complete disaster, and you were still kind of fortunate to win that game. Your non-conference slate being something you were good enough to handle, and then Arizona State having a terrible night, but your atmosphere playing a role. This was still not a great roster. They should have won more games. That's not me saying they shouldn't have won more games. They had more opportunities to win more games than they did. But roster-wise, 2025 was not where it needed to be. 2026, I think I probably said 2025 a few times. For 2026, is that roster comparable to the 2023 roster? And therefore, with the right coaching, could you see a step forward season? So let's kind of get into some of that. And we'll just start with some of the positions that I don't know if these are the places that are going to make the biggest difference. But in a lot of ways, we can compare. Are you stronger at a certain spot? We start at the top with quarterback. And 2023, obviously, fourth year Will Rogers. So senior Will Rogers. You brought in Mike Wright out of the portal. Chris Barson was a true freshman. And quarterback play was obviously a big problem for that team. Will Rogers did not handle the transition well. Obviously was injured, played 8 games, but in those 8 games only averaged about 200 yards a game, 12 touchdowns, 4 picks, ran for 1 score, 6.9 yards per attempt. Nice. Completed under 60% of his passes, which this is a guy that as a freshman competed 69%. Nice. Then 74% as a sophomore, 68% as a junior. His completion percentage dropped about 10 points for his career in that season. So he obviously did not have a very good year, and we know this. And look, the system didn't fit him. Mike Wright obviously did not have a great year as a passer. It's tough to judge in his starts. I guess I should go off that. The games that he really played, Western Michigan steps in with 7 of 10, 8 of 12 against Arkansas. Auburn, 85 passing yards against Arkansas, 161 against Auburn. Not a great day. I got benched against Kentucky. He didn't have a big year. Now, obviously, he had that running element, and Mike Wright struggled. I'm not going to spend a ton of time. What's up, Christian? How's it going? I'm not going to run down every single one of these positions, every single player. We know the quarterback position did not perform well. Now, I do think Will Rogers is still a better quarterback than a lot of the fan base gives him credit for. However, Will Rogers in that offense obviously was not great. And while Kamario Taylor does not have the reps to know for sure that guy is definitely going to step in and be outstanding, the talent's undeniable. And in the starts that we have seen him, you see where he could be very productive playing within this system. I feel better about Mississippi State at quarterback in 2025 than I did in 2023. Understanding the system that they're in. Obviously, the talent of Kamario is far, far better. I keep saying 2025, 2026 compared to in 2023. Obviously, the talent of Kamario is much, much better. We understand that. And the ceiling is much higher. But I just also trust him to be put in positions to succeed more. Even for all the gripes we've had with Lebby's system, I'm going to feel more confident in him being able to go out and be really, really effective. So I think you're better off at quarterback. Running back, You had a talented room in 2023. Woody Marks, obviously you got banged up, didn't have as big of a year as you would have liked to have seen, but Woody Marks was very good. Seth Davis was talented, number 2. Going into this season, you're looking at Fluff Bothwell coming back, Xavier Gayden coming back. You're bringing in a couple freshmen, J.J. Hill, Cooper Crosby, that you think have an opportunity to compete. Colin Wilson still there in the room. I think you were better off at running back in 2023. Just Woody Marks at his best is probably better than what we've seen from Fluff Bothwell thus far. Seth Davis, when healthy, I think showed more than what you've seen so far from Xavier Gayden. Feel better about the top end of that room. But I think you're fine at running back this year, but I think you were better back in 2023. Wide receiver is kind of an interesting spot because that 2023 receiver room, Tulu Griffin, all the hype in the world for the season that he was going to be able to have. Thank God we're moving him to the slot. Thank God we're giving him jet sweeps. I can rant about that for a long time, but I won't do that on this show. But Tulu was obviously a talented receiver. We know that. Xavier Thomas was a talented receiver. Justin Robinson, there were high expectations coming into the year, and you just didn't really get to see it materialize. And then kind of everybody else just didn't really factor in all that much. You go into this year, and you've got like an 800-yard receiver returning in Anthony Evans. You're bringing in a guy in Marquise Johnson from Missouri with over 1,000 career receiving yards. I think Aiden Williams, can he give you at least what Justin Robinson gave you? I kind of want to lump pass catcher in as a whole here and include tight end. Although, look, the tight end room in 2023 was a disaster. That group didn't pan out whatsoever. You have questions about the tight ends this year. I think you are probably at least comparable, potentially better off at receiver this year. You're definitely more explosive. I think Anthony Evans, to me, I think Ant Evans has shown, frankly, more consistency than you got out of Tulu. I guess my quick aside, I don't think Tulu Griffin was the same player a lot of fans think he was. That's kind of my take there. He was a very talented player for sure, and a guy that could have been used in other ways in his career. But I don't think he was the player that you try to force feed touches to in the way that a lot of the fan base believed he was. Regardless. But I think you're probably better with Ant Evans. I think Marquise Johnson could give you more than what the other guys have given you. So I think you're probably better off at a receiver standpoint than where you were that year. So already talking about this year compared to 2023, I like your chances overall skill talent-wise between quarterback and then your skill talent. I think you're in a better spot offensively than you were in 2023. Let's go over to defense. I'm going to save offensive line. I'll kind of get to the end because that's kind of the big deciding factor, I think, for a lot of this. We stand Tulu. Tulu's a good player. I don't like the way the conversation around him got. I think this idea that Leach was supposed to – I'm having the conversation. The idea Leach was supposed to, like, the fact he's not giving him the ball 10 times a game is coaching malpractice, I completely disagree. And I think we saw the offense where you tried to force feed him touches, and it didn't really result in all that much for State. Yes, he had the awesome game against South Carolina. I get it. Huge receiving day. South Carolina just played single high all day and let State take shots downfield to him. Okay. But this idea of just why don't you give him jet sweeps? Like, a lot of those plays just didn't work out for State. All right. I think Tulu at times, especially back in the air raid, when he did get opportunities, everybody does this thing of like every time he gave him the ball was a big play. One, you have to give part of that is understanding when to go to those plays. Two, dude dropped a lot of passes too. Like there's that. There were times they tried to hit big plays to him, and he did not come down with it. So that's my Tulu Griffin take. But yeah, I think overall offensively you're in the better spot. Now going over to defense, and I'm again set defensive line to the side. Let's go to linebacker. And defense is a big part. When we talk about SEC caliber roster, again, do you have big time athletes on the defensive side of the ball? And obviously Mississippi State in 2023 had those guys. defensively. I mean, Jet Johnson, Buki Watson, having those two dudes on your defense. I mean, Nathaniel Watson was insane that year. Buki had 137 tackles, 13 tackles for loss, 10 sacks, 2 passes broken up, 2 forced fumbles. Also an interception. An absolutely insane season. And a guy who was incredibly athletic at that linebacker position. Now, Jet was not the best athlete, although, I mean, hey, he did have those interception returns. But he was an experienced player who always found a way to get in the right spot. And he had 14 tackles for loss that year. I mean, he went and made some plays for sure. So you had the dudes at linebacker. Now, they were missing that Sam spot that they really needed somebody to step up, but you had the dudes at linebacker for sure. What about this team? I think you got the potential to have some really good dudes there. I look at Zachary Tillman and Tyler Lockhart, and like athleticism stands out. As I think those are two guys that just find ways to go and make plays. I think those are your two best athletes you've got at the linebacker position. You can't put that group ahead of 2023 just yet, at least at the top end. I will argue those two, but then Jalen Smith, Darian Gillette. I mean, I probably feel better about those 4 than I would feel about the top 4 or 5 for 2023. Now, obviously, Jet and Buki were so good. You can't put – I keep saying 2025. My goodness. 2026, I cannot put them ahead of 2023. But I think you've got a group at linebacker that has that type of potential to get there. So I really like what you've got at linebacker. I think it's 100% an SEC level group. And that's the other thing I haven't even really been labeling. Each position are you SEC level. Quarterback, yes. Kamari was an incredible talent. Running back, I still would say yes. Receiver, yes. Your SEC caliber at those spots. Your SEC caliber at linebacker. Secondary is where it gets fun, and I think you're better off than you were in 2023. You look at that 2023 secondary. So at corner, DeCamerion Richardson ended up being drafted by the Raiders. Fast player at corner, had some talent to him. Didn't have a shutdown season, but was pretty solid. DeCarlos Nicholson is a guy that ended up, when he transferred to USC, became a starter at USC. Played well there. Bryce Pollock kind of got thrown into action. It was before things really started to click for him. Cy Spurge was not a great player, which, I mean, it's funny. If you were someone who you're someone who remembers the Maroon Mike days, I got in trouble for saying I don't have faith in Asai Spurge because apparently Asai Spurge's dad was listening to the show and sent me a message or added me on that. That was kind of funny. But, I mean, look, guy didn't start for a reason. He wasn't a terrible player, but just wasn't a super big starter. Alex Fizel, OU and 4-1 wanted Tillman really bad. He's a good player, man, and I think he's a big-time talent, and I think you got something there. But that cornerback room was okay. Your starting duo was okay. They also got toasted by some of the best receivers they had, which is sometimes going to happen. I feel better about corner this year. Obviously, Kelly Jones is better than either of those guys. No question about it. Kelly Jones is better. He's a first-round pick. Quentin Taylor as a guy starting opposite of Kelly Jones, I would take him over, if we're saying your number 2 is DeCarlos Nicholson. I mean, they're probably comparable. Again, Nicholson became a solid starter at USC. If we're saying that guy could be a solid starter, your starting duo, I still think you're better off because of the ceiling of Kelly Jones. And if Quentin Taylor's your number 2, I think that's a good place to be. But then you add further depth where you start talking about Caleb Singleton, Jim Rock Grimsley, Jet Jefferson, if he delivers on some of the hype that he had going into last season. Kyle Johnson. You got more talent at corner than you did that year. And it's SEC level talent. You've got SEC dudes at corner. I don't have a question about that. Safety spot. Safety in 2023. Corey Ellington, Sean Preston, and Marcus Banks were your guys there leading the way in the safety room. Serviceable is the word I would give to that group. They kind of did just enough, but none of them were guys that you really trusted a ton in coverage. Marcus Banks probably a little bit more, but Preston was sort of just a hard hitter type guy. Ellington was just a veteran safety, but wasn't really a difference maker by any means. None of those guys were difference makers at safety. And then behind him, you had a true freshman, Isaac Smith. Chris Keys, Jordan Morant were still around, didn't really make much of a difference. A sophomore, Hunter Washington. I remember he made a big play against Arizona. But it was not a great safety room. You had a starting group that was just good enough. But it was not a group of starters that you would trust to start at a bunch of other SEC schools. I look at this group. Isaac Smith is a big-time talent. That's a guy that could start at several other SEC programs. And other SEC programs tried to get him. We know this, especially as a school in Oxford. You've got a really good talent there. Jordan Gilbert probably had an up and down go of things at LSU, but that's a guy LSU was playing a ton. That's a guy who played a ton when he was at Texas A&M. If you're playing a guy a lot, I'll trust you to be an SEC level player. Kendall Dolby, when healthy, was outstanding for Oklahoma. And then Marcus Williams coming in from Rice is a guy that I trust the experience there. Like, I'll take a ton of experience at safety, a guy who understands where he needs to be on the field. Just don't let things get crazy. So I think your top-end guys at safety, and then don't forget, you got a 5-star coming in, Braylon Womack, as well. You're better off at safety than you were in 2023. Will just reminded me of Sean and Shaz Preston seeing each other on the field in the Bama game. Yeah, that was a cool moment. People were making a big push trying to get Shaz Preston this year. Where did he end up landing? He transferred somewhere. Was it Indiana? I did not realize that. He ended up in Indiana. Interesting. We'll see how that works out for him. I mean, I don't have a strong feeling. He had a pretty good season for Tulane last year. I know that. So, yeah, best of luck to that dude. You had guys who were kind of borderline starters that season because you had lost a couple pretty good ones the year before. Because in 2022, I mean, look, Colin Duncan was kind of much maligned by a lot of fans, but Jalen Green was a really good player, and I thought Jackie Matthews was a pretty good player as well. So, like, you had a pretty solid group of safeties that season, and then you kind of just went from that to being okay. But I think this group surpasses that. I would say your secondary top to bottom is better than it was in 2022. And that was a group that had Emmanuel Forbes. Because, I mean, okay, Forbes is the first-round pick. Well, Kelly Jones is going to be a first-round pick. And I think everybody else, like top to bottom, DCAM that year, probably comparable to what you're getting with Quentin Taylor. But again, the corners behind him, I feel better this group. I think the safety group better. I really like the secondary top to bottom. You've got SEC caliber players in the secondary. So I'm looking at every spot on the field, and I can say Mississippi State has SEC level talent between quarterback, offensive skill players, linebacker, secondary. What do you have on the line of scrimmage? We'll start with defensive line because I think that's an interesting conversation. Because that 2023 defensive line didn't really have the type of year that I think people were expecting them to. You know, you had Jaden Crumedy coming back, who obviously had battled injuries the year before, but had been really, really good in 2022. Had played well, had some moments in 2021. But his final year, I mean, look, interior defensive lineman, obviously, you're not going to put up major numbers. But 35 tackles, 3.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, 2 quarterback hurries. It was a good year, but it wasn't the utter dominance that I think people were hoping to take that step forward to have. Nathan Pickering was disappointing, frankly. 44 tackles. He made some plays there in the middle, but only 3 tackles for loss, 3 quarterback hurries. His production had kind of dropped off from the previous year. More tackles because he was playing more, But really, I mean, his production fell off significantly from where it was in 21 and 22. And a lot of that is not having the guys around him. So that's not all on him, but he didn't take the step forward into being the guy that they needed in the middle of that defensive line. And then, defensive end was basically a non-factor. It was Deontay Anderson, DeMonte Russell. They played Don Terry Russell there some. You didn't really get anything out of your defensive end spot. You obviously didn't get anything from Sam linebacker either, which essentially was an edge position in that defense. That was kind of an underwhelming defensive line. And for obviously Crumity, an SEC level player, Pickering, an SEC level player. But that was not a defensive line that was great. They fell off dramatically. And they did not have SEC level players at the defensive end spots. Now, I go into this year for 2026, and it's a conversation. Because what does a fully healthy Will Whitson look like if that's a guy that gets to be a player that you lean on throughout the season? How good can Jalen Evans be stepping in as a guy that Texas A&M wanted to hold on to, Tennessee badly wanted? How good of a player can he be for you? Does Calvin Dinkins, who took a step forward this year, does he take that final step forward? Does DJ Reed, who showed some flashes, take another step forward? Does Dre Bledsoe take another step forward? You still got questions at the Sam linebacker spot. But if we're just focused on the defensive line, while there's no one guy that I can say for sure is as good as Jaden Crumity was, which still gives 2023 an edge. If you can get somebody to match that, I think you're probably just as good as you were in 2023 with the potential to be better. Now, you obviously had a couple linebackers in that defense that helped out that D-line a lot, making plays when those guys weren't always there. And to be fair, within this defense, the D-line's not always asked to make the big-time play. It's kind of about freeing up the linebacker. But I think, we remember Cam Young was obviously such a good player. And then Randy Charlton at defensive end was such a very good player the previous year in 2022. I don't know if you have guys that are going to be as good as that. But I think this defensive line can be as good as they were in 2023, which is not great, but that defense ended up being okay. So if I think you're talented everywhere else, like I sneakily have some excitement about the defense. And keep in mind, that defense did not have an edge rusher. And we're talking about a defense in 2023 that, when it was all said and done, gave up under 27 points a game. And from a total, where they were within the SEC in total defense, they were 6th in the SEC total defense. Yards per play, they were 7th. Versus the conference, they were top 4 in yards per play and top 5 in yardage. That was ended up being not a really good defense, but that was a fine defense. The defense played good enough that year that if they had an offense with the pulse, they would have won a lot more games. So I think you've got a better secondary than you did that year. Your linebackers are not as good, but have the potential to have huge seasons. And I don't think your D-line is as far off as maybe a lot of people think. So if we're saying that was an SEC-level defense in 2023, I think State's got an opportunity to be there in 2026. I think there's a chance it's pretty close. O-line is the spot that makes or breaks this more than anything else. Now, State's offensive line underwhelmed in 2023. If you look at sacks allowed on the season within the SEC, they were fine. They were top 5 in the SEC, gave up just over 2 sacks a game. Did not pave the way in the run game that you would have liked them to, though. That was a kind of an issue for them a little bit. They were 9th in the SEC in rushing, 7th in yards per rush. But, it was not a very productive run game that season. Obviously, the schematic shift hurt them in that. But it was kind of an average offensive line, all things considered. It was an average college football offensive line. There were games where it was rough. There were games where it was fine. There were never games where it was something they could really lean on. But it wasn't a complete and total disaster. And they also had guys back on that offensive line. And that's a key thing to remember. They had 4 starters come back on that group. Dollar Bill Johnson, Nick Jones, Cole Smith, and Cam Jones were all returning starters from what was a pretty good defensive line the year before. They lost LaQuinton Sharp at center. That was the one guy they lost. But they ended up moving Smith to center and then had Stephen Lasoya step in at one of the guard spots. They brought back a bunch of experience on that offensive line. It was a veteran group. Again, they disappointed a little bit compared to where they had been, but it was not a terrible offensive line. And with a better scheme, they would have been a lot more effective. This offensive line, it's tough to put ahead of that one or put on par with that one. You know, DJ Chester feels like his ceiling is probably a serviceable SEC starter. Cannon Boone is a serviceable SEC starter. What do you have after that? Brandon Snee, you are counting on him a ton. We have no idea if he can do it at this level. Miles McVay, you're probably counting on quite a bit. We don't know if he's a guy that is truly ready to be a power conference starter. Blake Steen is a guy you're probably going to count on quite a bit. He's coming back from injury, and we don't know, is he ready to be an SEC offensive lineman? Any of those young guys. Now, I will say the depth of talent and the talent ceiling in the offensive line room is better going into 2026 than it was in 2023. Because by that point in 2023, that was sort of the beginning of the makings of an offensive line that would become so disastrous. You didn't have anybody backing up that group outside of a young Albert Reese, who was still a few years away from being a solid player, that you could count on playing. Your O-line depth in 2023 was terrible. After your top group, you did not have guys that you wanted to put out there. I mean, some of the names, Percy Lewis never materialized. Cannon Boone, I didn't even realize was a backup center on that team. Grant Jackson didn't amount to anything. Leon Bell did not pan out. I guess he ended up actually becoming a decent player at other programs, but he got kicked off the team at state. Your O-line room just was you had no sort of depth at O-line. And that was an issue the previous recruiting up to that point. You had not put enough talent in that room. But your starting group was a group that you could start in the SEC and get away with. It was not it was a lower tier SEC offensive line, but it was not a terrible offensive line that year. Sven giving us a Hail State. It's up. It was a group you could have done enough within the SEC that year. Again, if you had put them in a better scheme, if you had not asked them to be a team that is going to try to run outside doing every single play like they did that year, they could have been better off. This year, it's tough to just assume that that's what they're going to be. It is a complete wait and see on this offensive line. The younger guys, again, the ceiling is there that's higher than what you had that year in 2023. But the starting group, you cannot come anywhere close to feeling as confident in that group. Now, again, 2023 got screwed over because of the schematic shift. You're not doing that with this team, although in some way it's a little – you're bringing in a bunch of guys that haven't run this offense. So how is that going to pan out? That's the one area where you definitely have to get more figured out. Now, I will say, I mentioned the returning production stuff that we're going to get into in another episode for sure. By that chart, I think Mississippi State checks in 10th in the SEC in terms of experience on the offensive line, in terms of snaps played. I know the graphic, I think it was Dear Old State, I think it originally put out the retweet or posted the screenshot of it that had State like second to last in the SEC in terms of snaps. That was before DJ Chester's numbers got added in. So you're like 10th in the SEC. Better than where you were in terms of return production, but still not a great spot. You're still low in the league in terms of experience up front. That is the last spot for me. And I mean, look, it's both lines of scrimmage. And Spin, these lines will be epic bad once again. Lebby did nothing to fix it. I don't think the D line is going to be epic bad. I don't know if it's going to be great or not. My question for D line, can it be? I'm expecting the D line to at very least be passable. Can it get to being good? I don't know. I'm not predicting one way or another. I think the D line has a ceiling where if a couple guys hit, I think that group is fine within the SEC. I'm pretty confident in this defense, all things considered. It's the other side of the ball, and it's offensive line, which feels crazy to talk about when we're talking about Lebby, as the offense is where I got some pause. And I'm foolish to have that sort of confidence, but I do believe in Arnett a little bit. I also believe in Arnett's system to just kind of make it work, where, as I've talked about here, 2023, they were not great up front on that defensive line. Jaden Crumedy was an NFL talent, yes. He also really hasn't done anything in the NFL to this point. They still made it work. They had no pass rush off the edge in that defense, and they ended up having a pretty solid year defensively, all things considered. I think they could get similar results this year. Can you get the offense to be better? Now, it's a low bar to clear. I think they'll be better offensively than they were in 2023 just because that offense was just such a disaster. But we're talking about to be able to take a step forward, to be able to go to a bowl game. In 2023, we had Jet Johnson Company. Yes, but and I don't know if you were in here when I was talking about it earlier. I think Zachary Tillman, Tyler Lockhart, Isaac Smith, Kelly Jones, some of the other guys in the secondary as well. I think the back seven of your defense is top to bottom deeper. It's definitely deeper. The secondary is more talented than you had in 2023. It is a better secondary than you had in 2023. Linebacker is a little bit deeper, although again, you're not better because of Jet Johnson, Buki Watson. I think though Tillman and Lockhart are going to have really big years. Is kind of my thought there. I think the linebackers you have are going to be really, really effective within this defense. It's defensive line. Can a few of those guys hit? But this one I was kind of breaking down. I don't think they're so far off from where they were in 2023 on defensive line. Again, that 2023 defensive line had one guy that ended up being drafted, if I remember correctly, and that was Crumedy. If you told me one of these guys clicked, I think that's a possibility for this year. And I keep saying it. They had no pass rush in 2023 off the edge. Their pass rush was blitzing Buki Watson. So I think you can get similar level of production to that. It goes back to the other side of the ball, offensive line. Are you SEC caliber on the offensive line? Right now, I have to say no. Until I see otherwise, I have to say no. And I really can't even go off what we see in the spring because it's impossible to have heavy takeaways from the spring. Obviously, it would be a positive development if the O-line plays well in the spring. You can't make any definitive takeaways from that, but it would be a start. If they struggle in the spring again like they did last year, all right. And again, it could start to come together, but that's a bigger question. So, I mean, look, overall, do I think you have an SEC level roster? I think you're close. I think you're very close. It really, for me, is a matter of lines of scrimmage. Have you gotten there? But I think you probably are comparable roster-wise to where you were in 2023, which is a team that with a different offensive system would have been perfectly fine within the SEC. Hail State, Micah. I get that team was disappointing. If you have a 2023 type season, that's a problem for Lebby. He's not going to be your coach again. But that roster was good enough to be better. And as I said off the jump, the roster this past year, they could have won more games. That was more an indictment, though, on the schedule that they played than anything else. So, I think it's the best roster Lebby's had. There's not a question about that. It's just a matter of, has he officially gotten them back to where they were before he took over, which was a good enough roster to actually be able to compete within the SEC with the proper coaching. We'll see. But I think you're close. I think State's back to have an SEC level roster. Final verdict, I would say I'm 75-25 that yes, they're there, but it really hinges on a couple positions clicking. And O-line is the big elephant in the room where that's one of the most important to being there. And I still don't know if they're quite there yet. That'll do it for me tonight. Again, see, I said I didn't know how much we could talk about. I went 50 minutes and had the one topic because I have a way to make these one little ideas turn into long episodes, but happy to do it. Glad to be back. That'll do it for me. I'll be back Thursday with the call-in show Thursday evening. So if you guys want to come be a part of that, we'll be glad to have you. If you haven't already, please leave us a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel. Have the notifications turned on so you do know when we do go live. And as always, swing your sword. Hail State.
College football is even more exciting when you've got some action on the line, and the games are even better when you're cashing in. And the Voice of College Football is the place to be to get the greatest value. Start with my picks. 75% against the money line, 58% against the spread, and I've got a 40-plus year track record. 11-0 in the college football playoff for me last year against the money line, 8-3 against the spread. And I'm just the warm-up act. Steve Merrill of Wager Talk is our ace in the hole, show stopper. 7 years with the Voice of College Football, over 30 years in the industry. Steve gives us analysis on all the big games, but you can't miss Steve's weekly under-the-radar pick. 28-12 against the spread the last 3 years. You also get picks from some of our top analysts here at the Voice of College Football, including Corey Bratta, Matt Zemek, and Steve Dace. Check out those numbers. Become a YouTube or Patreon member for just $99 per month. Go to the main channel on YouTube, click join, and then select the betting tier. Do the same thing on Patreon. Make 2025 a winner now.